Hey everyone, Sir Dux Lancelot here in human avatar form. With Civ 7 being announced, I think it's about time to do a Civ 6 tutorial. This will be a multi-part series. But first, if you're new to the channel, a big welcome. To give a little background about myself, I have about 7,000 hours in Civ 6. My channel has a variety of unique challenges, casual single-player games, and single-player speedruns. And I also got into multiplayer several years ago and have learned a lot from multiplayer that I believe can help in single-player too. That said, this tutorial will focus exclusively on single-player deity level. Should be helpful for somewhat experienced beginner and intermediate players. Also, I'm always happy to answer any questions, so feel free to ask anything in the comments and I'll answer the best I can. And if you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. In this first tutorial, we'll focus on the early game. Let's start with tiles and city placement. First, city center tiles have a minimum of 2 food and 1 production. So even if the tile you're settling on has less than that, you'll still always get at least 2 food and 1 production. City center tiles remove features that are settled on. So features are things like woods, rainforest, and marsh. So any yields associated with those features will also be removed when you settle on them. However, city center tiles retain the underlying terrain and resource yields. So a plains hill, which is 1 food, 2 production, will provide 2 food, 2 production. 2 food because the minimum a city center can provide is 2 food. And then you're going to get that extra 1 production because the underlying terrain has 2 production on it. This is why it's better to settle on a plains hill tile than a grassland hill tile, because you get that extra 1 production because the terrain that you settle on has an extra 1 production on it. A grassland hill settle is the same as a flat grassland settle because you have that minimum 2 food, 1 production on city center tiles, so 2, 1 in either case. You'll also keep resources when you settle on them. So with resources, it's common to maybe get an extra food on your city center tile if you settle on one. So let's say we settled on this rice tile. Let's say it was here and we settled on it. That would give us 3 food and 1 production because you can go higher than that 2 food minimum. So consider the underlying tile when you're settling your city. It may be worth taking an extra turn to move on to a better tile, say from a grassland hill to a plains hill. All else equal, that is. For worked tiles, you'll probably want to consider 4 yield food and production tiles, the minimum. So that could be a 2 food, 2 production tile or a 3 food, 1 production tile, for example. For example, if you look in the city building screen, you'll see, say, a scout costs 30 production and it costs 120 gold. So that means it takes 4 gold to equal 1 production, and 4 gold tiles don't really exist early, so focus on food and production. Note that wonder tiles with big science and culture yields can be enticing, but they're likely not worth working too early since they usually lack in food and production, sometimes even to the point of stopping population growth altogether. Plus, district production cost scales with research techs and civics, so too much early science and culture can delay your districts. That said, sometimes a high faith tile can be nice to work early for a few turns so that you get a solid pantheon fast, even if it otherwise sets a city back a bit. If you're running out of 4 yield food and production tiles, buy more as you need them. And a little note here about 1 food, 3 production tiles. I mean, those are 4 yield tiles, but they will stagnate a city's growth. So you really only want to work those if you can offset it with more food on another tile. Ideally, you want to settle on fresh water tiles like rivers or lakes for the housing that they give. If the city's going to be building a harbor, though, then it may not need that fresh water because the lighthouse will give the extra housing that it's missing. A non-freshwater city should only be justified by some really big increase in yields because you'll have to waste turns making a granary pretty early just to get close to baseline housing. Also, you'll probably want to consider luxury resources. A city with a couple unique luxuries you don't have yet is probably worth slightly reduced yields since luxury resources provide amenities which can provide a percentage boost to your overall empire-wide yields. And we'll talk more about amenities later. Now let's get into build orders a little bit. You probably want to get at least 1 or 2 scouts early. You can't even build settlers until 2 population, so a couple scouts usually times pretty well with being able to reach 2 population and then starting a settler. Scouts usually pay off in the form of era score, tribal villages, meeting city-states, meeting other civs, and it really can't be overstated how important it is to meet city-states. City-states make a big difference in games. Make 1 to 3 settlers after scouts, but if you play with regular barbarian settings, you may realistically need to switch to military units if barbs are encroaching. This largely depends on chance, so this is why I personally prefer to play with barbs off or modded to be toned down. How many settlers you make after your scouts depends on whether you plan to go for a religion. If you're planning to get a good religion, and you probably should, since faith is so powerful in Civ 6, you'll probably want to build your first holy site in your capital right after finishing your first or second settlers. Otherwise, the deity AI could beat you to a religion. Also, consider walking distance for your settlers. Each additional turn that you spend walking is, in some sense, like the settler took an extra turn to build, and that can really slow down the overall progress of your empire. Especially for early cities, try to settle within 4 or 5 tiles of your capital. Anything further should only be justified by a big increase in yields. I'm not saying it's never justified walking 8 turns to a really good natural wonder, but it better be a Kilimanjaro city with multiple 4 food, 4 production tiles, or something like that. Now let's talk about amenities. A good time to start considering amenities is probably after you have your first 3 cities or so settled. You don't really have to consider them before that. If you can settle on a luxury resource, that's always really good. On the tech tree, you'll want to research the techs that unlock the improvements associated with whatever luxury resources you have. So if you have a bunch of plantation resources, you'll want to get irrigation pretty quickly. If you've got quarry luxuries, then you'll want to get masonry pretty quickly. So at this point in the game, this is basically when you want to start maybe getting a builder or two, getting those amenities improved, make sure you're teching to the right tech. And if you can get to at least the happy level +3 amenities, then you get an extra 10% boost to all your yields in your empire. So that's why amenities are so important. It's 20% if you can get to +5. Okay, so we've discussed amenities, but what about housing? Well, as long as your cities have been settled on fresh water, you should have plenty of housing early in the game. For example, a capital on fresh water has 6 housing, and then other cities have 5 housing. Let's discuss the civic tree and policies now. Once you reach Code of Laws, you'll unlock the Chiefdom government, which is the first government. And this will kind of be your first decision. Do you play God King or do you play Urban Planning? God King gives you some faith, which you can use to accumulate toward a pantheon. But Urban Planning is just a lot better because it really takes 2 faith to equal 1 production. And then it takes 4 gold to equal 1 production. So even if this is just 1 production, it's still better than this. And soon you'll have multiple cities, in which case you'll be getting 1 production for each city, whereas this is just locked in empire-wide 1 gold, 1 faith. Because it's such an early point in the game, it's actually a pretty crucial decision. And by crucial decision, I mean it's going to have, like, 1 production or 1 faith or 1 of whatever yield is going to have a big percentage impact on your overall empire at this point. However, even though urban planning is basically just stronger, you may need to run God King to get a pantheon. So that's why it may still be necessary to run it, because it is important to get a good pantheon. Or sometimes it's important to get a good pantheon, I should say. But if you're building holy sites early, you're going to get faith from those if they have any adjacency, and you can use that faith to accumulate toward a pantheon. So whenever I'm doing holy sites first, which is probably most games in the unmodded version of Civ 6, then I will just run urban planning. The religious settlements pantheon, which gives you the free settler, is usually taken so early in the game that it doesn't really matter. God King is usually too slow to even get that. But if you have like another source of faith, and maybe it's a close call, maybe a few turns running God King could make sense and get you that religious settlements pantheon. Now for the military slot here, I usually just run survey for the scout experience. Unless I see barbs, then I'll put discipline in. There does tend to be a lot of barbs early, and they can be a real nuisance, so I could understand basically just by default putting this in. Now back to the civic tree. Generally, I would recommend doing foreign trade and early empire before craftsmanship and state workforce. Foreign trade unlocks the trade route capacity. And then, of course, early empire provides the colonization card, which is really good for making settlers. And then for like military tradition and mysticism, I would probably just do political philosophy first and then come back later and get those two. And you do unlock governor titles here with early empire and state workforce, but we'll discuss governors more in another episode. And now we'll briefly discuss the tech tree. Tech tree path largely depends on which districts you want to start with. And that really depends largely on your overall strategy and your victory condition, which we're going to talk about in a future tutorial. That said, if you're planning to get a religion, and you probably should, in most games at least, then you'll need to get astrology unlocked early. The AI will sometimes get religions early, so you want to get your holy sites built pretty fast. And then, of course, focus, as mentioned before, focus on the techs that give you the improvements that you need to get your luxury resources and maybe your strategic, maybe horses. So now that we've got the general basic 3-city layout of our early game, let's discuss a few miscellaneous items. After the first few cities are settled, we're going to want to build or buy a trader. I usually like to buy the trader in one of the weaker cities because the trade route will get more yields based on how many districts are at the destination, and that the capital is usually going to have more districts earlier than those other cities. So it's going to be a little stronger if you're sending a route to the capital usually. Also, a trade route's yields will depend on whether the route is foreign or domestic. Unless you're playing the Civ with a unique boost to foreign trade routes will really only provide a few gold and maybe one additional yield at this point in the game, while domestic routes will provide 1 food and 1 production. At this point in the game, food and production are kind of worth about the same. So domestic route provides the equivalent of 8 gold per turn, assuming 4 gold is 1 production. That's why the domestic route is preferable in most cases this early. Builders are also good to build at this point in the game, especially if an expansion city has luxuries or can add food or production to its best tiles with a builder. Then starting with a builder could be a good idea. What you don't want to do is just improve tiles that aren't your best tiles. Like you wouldn't want to get a builder and then improve this and make this a 3-food farm when you've got a 2-food, 2-production tile you can work without even needing a builder on it. And then monuments is the other obvious thing that's good to build at this point. They should probably be built in all cities before or after builders. Culture is really important for gaining better policy cards, better governments, stuff like that. Now let's talk about the good stuff, the exploits. Depending on your preferred playstyle, you may wish to use AI exploits or not. Whatever the case, just realize that there are different levels, basically, of exploitation, and games can't really be comparable unless they use similar levels of exploitation. It's not really my thing, but I'll outline a few different levels, I guess, of AI exploitation. In the high category, we have strategic resource swapping. The AI values strategic resources they don't have, so you can sell strategic resources to them when they have none, and then buy them back for less, and then just repeat that process until their gold is completely drained. And then in the medium category, I'd say is just Diplo favor swapping. Early in the game, the AI doesn't value Diplo favor, so you can buy it from them really cheap, like 1 gold, and then you can resell it to them later on for a lot more once they start to value it. And then finally, in the low category, some probably wouldn't even consider this an exploit. They might be right, but some people do consider it an exploit. Basically selling strategic and luxury resources or Diplo favor just in general. So if you have like a duplicate luxury, selling it for gold. Personally though, for me, I find exploits to be tedious. I think it makes games difficult to compare. So I usually prefer not to use any of these, but I certainly have in the past. And if you want to if you're competing in a speedrun contest or something like that, you may have to really resort to these practices to the maximum. Okay, now to summarize, at this point we have a good foundation for pursuing not only any victory type, but really almost any strategy too. We have several cities settled in an efficient manner. We're building up our cities, starting the compounding snowball that will hopefully grow for the rest of the game. In the next tutorial, we're going to discuss choosing a strategy and a victory type and all that goes with that. Thanks for watching, everybody. That's all I've got for this tutorial. Welcome your tips and your feedback on this. Let me know how the format is, how I can improve. But hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching. Oh, by the way, who loves my Civ 6 clock? Thanks, Mama Ducks.